US President Joe Biden has spent the past 13 or 14 months tut-tutting over the death toll as Israel has committed genocide. From time to time he's expressed concern about, the number of deaths or the lack of humanitarian aid. But at the end of the day, the words have just been that, just words, because the flow of American weapons to the Israeli military, to the IDF, has never stopped. An Al Jazeera investigation has revealed that over the past year, US and Britain have created what is known as an air bridge to Israel, with 120 cargo planes making more than 6,000 trips, including hundreds of flights carrying weapons. Israel has never been at serious risk of running out of military equipment. The US has made more than 100 military sales to Israel since the start of the genocide, including tank ammunition, components to make 150mm artillery shells, precision-guided munitions, small-diameter bombs, bunker busters and small arms. Just once, Biden has held back on military supplies, and that was the largest of the bombs when Israel was attacking Rafah. But that has been the exception to the rule. And in August, the US announced a further $30 billion worth of weapon sales to Israel, including jets, missiles and mortar rounds. And as the death toll in Gaza and Lebanon has climbed, Biden has reconfirmed his, quote, ironclad commitment to Israel's security in a conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, the US has been threatening to cut off weapons supplies if Israel has not met a 30-day deadline for supplying aid to Gaza, where hunger stalks the rubble-laden streets, where the north of Gaza is basically being ethnically cleansed. But the US may not follow through with that, and they have the option of punishing Israel by simply refusing to veto resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. In other words, there will be very little impact on Israel one way or the other. And of course, we are not that far off now from Trump launching his second presidency. And we need to remember that Trump, in his first presidency, declared that Jerusalem was Israel's capital, which was a complete denial of the somewhat futile but symbolic hopes that people hold for a two-state solution, and pushed the Abraham Accords, which was the normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan and Morocco. And there's a very good chance that those accords will be expanded to include Saudi Arabia, a process that was brought to a halt by the beginning of the genocide in 2023. And Trump has said he wants the war to finish, which has led some people rather naively to believe that he would bring peace to Palestine. But there's a very good chance that finishing war means more brutality, a green light for Netanyahu to go in harder both against the Palestinians, the Lebanese and potentially against Iran. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. So why is the US so determined to stand by Israel as it commits genocide in Gaza and bombs the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria and Iran? Now, for many people, the common sense answer is the influence of the Zionist lobby in the United States. Now, there's no question that Israel supporters are well funded and are influential. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee and others spent tens of millions of dollars in the recent election to support challengers running against candidates regarded as even partially pro-Palestine. But to see the Zionist lobby as controlling US politics is to get things the wrong way round. In fact, it actually opens the door to a potentially anti-Semitic understanding of what is going on. And let me be clear, most people I know who say that the Zionist lobby is hugely influential are not anti-Semitic, but the idea that somehow the Zionists are running US politics but can bleed over on the far right into the idea that Jews are running American politics, and that is absolutely false. We need to be clear that pro-Israel lobbyists appear influential and gain in influence because the US sees Israel as an indispensable ally in a region of huge strategic importance. In other words, it's the role that Israel can play for the United States that makes Israel important and therefore makes its supporters influential in the corridors of power. We need to remember that up until really the Holocaust and the Nakba, the two catastrophes that preceded the founding of the State of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians, the Zionist lobby in America was very weak, and even the influence of the broader Jewish community was also relatively insignificant. This is only a few years before the war, less than a decade before the founding of the State of Israel. There was an international conference in Evian in France in 1938 where Western countries discussed taking Jewish refugees from Germany and from Austria. The United States basically, like virtually every other country, said, nah, too difficult, we're not doing it. A year later, the passenger ship, the St. Louis, with 900 passengers on board, Jewish refugees from Europe, tried to get entry into Cuba and into the United States. It was turned back. The lobby, whether you want to call it Zionist or Jewish lobby in America, was not strong enough to force the American government to accept refugees. And that on the eve of the Second World War, when Hitler had already been in power for 6 years. And during the war itself, there were things like the refusal to bomb the train tracks running into the Auschwitz death camps. So in other words, on multiple fronts, Jews in America were not very influential, and actually the Zionists were only marginal to the Jewish community. Now that all changed as the US emerged as a superpower after the war and began to supplant Britain and France in the Middle East. The Middle East is of enormous strategic importance to capitalism and to Western imperialism and the US in particular. It still boasts 50% of the world's oil supplies. In addition, between 12 and 15% of global trade, including 30% of global container traffic, passes through the Suez Canal. So for the US, its support for Israel is not about, first and foremost, its support for Zionism. It's about supporting its own capitalist and imperialist interests. And that's why it has 40,000 soldiers and sailors in the region. It has those fighters based in 19 military bases, 8 of them are permanent. And the United States is currently self-sufficient in oil, but by dominating the Middle East, it can control oil flows to both allies in Europe and rivals such as China, confirming its global dominance. So the US has both failed to restrain and has enabled Israel throughout genocide and war. Similarly, France and Germany have said that ending the war in Gaza is so-called necessity, but shortly afterwards Germany increased its arms exports. For Western imperialism and above all US imperialism, control of the Middle East is of vital strategic importance, and it is on that basis that Zionism is given a privileged hearing in the corridors of power. Now, Israel does not always follow orders from Washington. The US was critical, for example, of the massive attack on Rafah earlier this year, and the recent decision by the Netanyahu government to effectively outlaw the UNRWA relief agency. Netanyahu is openly contemptuous of Biden. He sees him as weak and keeps on provoking further conflict in the Middle East, knowing that Biden will be drawn along. And Netanyahu wanted Trump to win on the 5th of November and now regards his position as strengthened because of Trump. And it looks likely that he'll ignore the deadline for aid to Gaza. Israel's value to the White House is that it can carry out attacks that would be politically too risky for the US. So if America were to bomb Iran, for instance, it would risk provoking Russia and China, both of which have drawn closer to Tehran. So by backing Israel, the US can send a message to the Iranian regime, which is the major obstacle to total American domination of the region, while minimizing the possibility of escalating the conflict. That doesn't mean they stand aside when Iran and Israel face off. The US has moved a lot of military forces into the region. It's moved anti-missile batteries into Israel, staffed by US soldiers. There's no question that the US is with Israel against Iran, but using Israel as its attacking force gives it a certain distance and plausible deniability. And the attacks on Lebanon fit the same mould. When Israel attacks Hezbollah, it weakens the influence of Iran and benefits the US's overall agenda. The US has other allies in the region, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but only Israel, as a settler colonial state that is directly dependent on the West, is guaranteed never to go an anti-imperialist revolution. We saw in 2011 the potential for revolt from below across the Middle East. The one country where that revolt has not taken place and cannot take place is Israel, given that the vast mass of the population is locked into support for Zionism and Western imperialism and benefits materially, socially, politically, culturally on a massive scale from interdependence with the West. Now, if there are tensions between the US and Israel, they come first and foremost from Americans' concern that Israel's genocidal offensive might provoke unrest and potentially revolution in Arab countries. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has visited Israel 11 times in the past year to navigate that narrow path between smashing Iran's allies Hamas and Hezbollah and avoiding regional conflict. And the problem that the US faces, that Western imperialism faces, is that millions of Arabs stand in solidarity with Palestine, which puts them at odds with the leaders, their leaders who collaborate with Israel and the US. As the Saudi ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, told Blinken in September, quotes, "Do I care personally about the Palestinian issue? I don't, but my people do." And the fear for the United States is that mass anger over Palestine confuse with widespread discontent over falling living standards. And when they call for Israel to restrain itself, it's not because they are humanitarians. It's not because of they care about the death toll in Gaza or Lebanon or anywhere else in the region. They're worried about pushing the Arab masses one step too far and letting loose a process of revolt that they may not be able to control. So if you look at Egypt, the dictator Abdel Fattah el-Sisi bans rallies in support of Palestine, but recently urged a 2-day ceasefire, walking both sides of the street at once. And the Western-backed butcher is no friend of the Palestinians, but he's worried about his own regime, which is racked by economic crisis. So, for instance, the International Monetary Fund chief, Kristalina Georgieva, visited Cairo in early November to discuss a loan to Egypt of $11.8 billion. Now, to get that loan, El-Sisi has agreed to a quote-unquote reform package, and he's pushing through sharp cuts to subsidies for fuel, bread and electricity, the basics of life. Bread is a fundamental part of the diet of the Egyptian poor. And now El-Sisi is worried, and the US is worried, that the pace of the free market reforms could trigger anger. So, for example, quite recently, workers at the state-owned Egyptian aluminium company began a sit-down against management's decision to slash the share of profits. And when bosses ignored workers' demands, they struck the following day. Now, that strike was over immediate economic demands at one company. But economic demands and a struggle over economic demands can quite quickly lead to a fusion with political demands. The same workers who are angry with their bosses over pay that hardly keeps them alive are also angry with Israel over the genocide in Gaza, and angry with El-Sisi for presiding over both. So the struggle of workers can come together with political struggles against the Egyptian dictatorship, its US imperialist sponsors, and Israel. And as I mentioned, we saw that during the Arab Spring of 2011, when revolutions brought down Western-backed dictators and isolated Israel. The Egyptian regime, under Mubarak, the previous semi-dictator, had a buffer between him and the people. The Muslim Brotherhood opposition allowed for some degree of people speaking out, but without really threatening the regime. El-Sisi has destroyed that buffer. There is nothing between him and the anger of his people other than the guns of the military. And this means the regime is brutal and relies on savage repression, but it's also potentially vulnerable to movements from below. So anger over the cuts and El-Sisi's backing of Israel can explode, challenging the hold of imperialism and its Israeli watchdog. That is the nightmare for Netanyahu and Trump, and that is the hope for Palestine.